Hello, everyone. My name is Warren Smith, and I'm the Vice President for Mission Advancement at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Those of you who are on the East Coast like me, I should say good afternoon. I know the rest of you are probably scattered all over the country, so I will say good morning. We, for the next hour, have the privilege of chatting with Jeremiah Johnston, who is the founder and president of the Christian Thinker Society, and he's the author of this great book, Unimaginable, What Our World Would Be Like Without Christianity. We're really excited at the Colson Center to offer this book as our donor premium for the month of February, and we're also excited to have Jeremiah as one of our plenary session speakers at the Wilberforce weekend, which will take place in May. I'm going to give you a little bit more information about both of those two developments, both how you can get the book and also how you can hear Jeremiah at the Wilberforce weekend at the end of our broadcast today. By the way, our end will be at 1 o'clock. We will end promptly at 1 o'clock Eastern time because I know many of you have lives to get back to, but we are so honored that you have given us this hour to visit about some really important topics. And again, before I turn the floor over to Jeremiah, I wanted to mention a couple of housekeeping items that might make this experience more fruitful and more effective for you. Number one is that we want to hear questions from you. Now, depending upon the device you are using today to watch this webinar, either at the top of your screen or at one of the sides of your screen, you will see a little sidebar and a tab that says questions. If you click on that tab, a box will open up and you will be able to type any question that you have for Jeremiah or for me into that box. I'll see those here. We often get far more questions that we can answer over the course of the hour or the half hour that we're going to devote to questions, but we'll get to as many of those as we can. The second thing that I wanted to mention to you today is that we will be recording this session, and tomorrow we will send you an email, no later than tomorrow. It could even be later today, but I don't want to make a promise I can't keep. So we'll say no later than tomorrow. We will send you a link that will have a recording of this session, along with a couple of notes from us that will, for example, if we mention a book or a slide presentation that we want to add as a resource, you'll have some of those additional resources as well. My request is that you use this recording, this link that we're going to send you, as a tool so that you can be more effective in your sphere of influence. If you're a pastor, feel free to share it with your congregation. If you're a small group leader, feel free to use it in your small group. One request, we would ask that you keep this off of social media, for example, Facebook or Twitter or other sort of mass file sharing platforms. We might be sharing some information or using some images that we don't have copyright cleared for that. And so it would be really helpful for us if you would not share it on mass platforms, but if you want to share it within your sphere of influence, we would be honored if you would do so. So with those couple of opening questions, and I'll have a few more announcements at the end, as I mentioned, about the Wilberforce weekend and about how you can get copies of Jeremiah's book. Let me bring in Jeremiah Johnston. Jeremiah Johnston, as I mentioned, is the president of the Christian Thinkers Society. He has all kinds of degrees, 2 earned master's degrees, an earned PhD, and of course, as I said, he's the author of this book, Unimaginable, What Our World Would Be Like Without Christianity, which was out late last year from Baker Bethany House. I've read this book. I love this book. This is the book that caused us to want to invite Jeremiah, among many other accolades that Jeremiah has achieved over his career. This is the book that really wanted us to bring Jeremiah to the Wilberforce weekend, because the theme of our Wilberforce weekend this year is Christianity still good for the world? And Jeremiah, with that preamble, let me bring you in and just say that, or just ask the question, is Christianity still good for the world? We know that throughout history, and you document some of this history in your book, Unimaginable, Christianity has been a tremendously positive force, but we've had a lot of the new atheists who say that Christianity is no longer good for the world and may even be negative for the world. What's your response to that?
Well, first, I just want to say, Warren, it's so great to be talking with you on this webinar today. I'm so grateful for you, for John Stone Street, for everyone at the Colson Center. I am delighted and ecstatic to be participating in the Wilberforce weekend. I hope everyone watching this is registered and will come join us in D.C. in a couple of months. You're exactly right, Warren. There is a growing hostility towards the Christian faith, but I want to say this, it is uncritical. It is unfounded, and yet 63% of atheists and agnostics believe that the Christian church, listen carefully to the nuance, contributes little or nothing to society at all to help address important social issues. In other words, my paraphrase is, if you allow the media to educate you, and a Christian thinker doesn't allow the media to educate you, and all God's people said amen, or if you let social media educate you, if you let the left or secularist naturalist educate you, they will lead you to believe that Christianity and the church specifically is utterly irrelevant to our lives. And so, wow, is that a truthful statement? And yet most believers in Jesus Christ, no matter how long they've been following Christ, they sometimes get a stutter or deer in the headlights look about how do I answer that? I know Christianity is good for the world, but how do I answer that? Well, Warren, the message and passion of my life is to help Christians, not just a few Delta Force elite, but every Christian follow the command of Jesus Christ to love God with their heart, soul, and mind. And so I'm dedicated to equipping Christians at our organizations to answer the trending questions of the day. And this question is so pertinent. It's so relevant. It's why you all are doing a whole conference. Is Christianity still good for the world? And therefore, I just wanted to answer it. And the great news is, yes, Christianity is wonderful for the world. It would be an unimaginable world if Christians were not in it. And I look forward to continue that dialogue.
Yeah, sure. Well, Jeremiah, one of the interesting aspects of your book, one of the parts of your book that I found the most fascinating and interesting is that, we don't have to guess about whether what the world would be like without Christianity. You begin your book by noting that in popular culture today, there are a lot of television shows and movies and even books that some people call alternative histories. A show like, for example, The Man in the High Castle or a Westworld may be an example of that to a lesser extent, where they look at the world in a way different from the way it is historically developed. But we don't have to do that. We can just look into history and we can see a world without Christianity. Before Jesus came, for example, we can see a world in which other ideologies have tried to banish Christianity, like Nazism, for example, like Marxism. Would you say more about that idea and what the world looks like from a historical perspective when it has tried to banish Christianity?
Yeah, great question, Warren. Well, it turns out that alternative history is a really fun way to learn. It's a great way to teach. And guess what? As you've already mentioned, it's a great way to be entertained. So many of the Emmy Award-winning shows, so many movies take place in alternative universe. What if this wouldn't have happened? It would have had this chain reaction. And so you're exactly right. Audrey and I binge watching Amazon's Man in the High Castle, where it imagines this world where the Axis powers won World War II. I just, in between shows, would just reference the undeniable difference that the Christian church has made historically and in modern times. And my amazing wife, Audrey, looks at me and said, Jeremiah, most Christians are unaware of these things. They're just unaware, and therefore we don't take the courage that we need to. And as I began to pray about writing this book, and I wanted to write it completely differently, I wanted to write it in a way it would be memorable. And so you're exactly right, Warren. You and I have been to many similar places where Christianity is not the dominant belief system. Right as I was praying through writing this book, I was a part of a leadership delegation with the Museum of the Bible that went to Cuba before it was cool to go to Cuba. We went to Santiago, Cuba. And, it was amazing for me just a few miles from Miami to see a country where there were no churches anywhere. And what did we see when we studied what was happening in Cuba after 40 years of the Bible being outlawed? Distribution of the Bible was outlawed. By the way, I added something to my CV I'm very proud of. I became a Bible smuggler on that trip. We can talk about that later if you want. But I saw what happened when literally the entire community came out, the entire community in Santiago, to see the Bible exhibit. And I thought, wow, what a difference Christianity makes, because this was a culture that was bankrupt, not just financially, socially, morally. It was a society without hope. And so when I thought about writing it, I thought we could answer this question by saying we don't, as you rightly say, as a historian, and that's what I am. I'm a historical Jesus scholar specializing in Jesus and Judaica, the world of Jesus and the nascent or early Christianity. We can study what was that world like exactly. when the Apostle Paul wrote in Galatians 3:28 that there is neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's neither male nor female, we are all one in Christ Jesus. If we're not careful, friends, if we don't read the Bible like Tom Wright says with first century eyes, we can let some of these passages slide right on by, and we have no idea how they utterly change the world in which they were presented. And so but as I was praying, I thought of Judges 2:10. And Judges has two, I think, very cryptic passages, Warren, but one of, I think, the most cryptic is right after the Joshua generation. It says, and I have my scriptures right here, there arose after that generation another generation that did not know the Lord or the works which he had done for Israel. And when I think about the church today, we have amazing, well-meaning Christians who have forgotten the great inheritance of the Christian faith. And so we remain silent. The left gets all of the play in the media. And so my whole passion is to equip Christians with, as a historian, as a critical thinker, can we actually measure the difference that the Christian faith makes? And friends, indeed we can. And so I quantify that in this book.
Well, Jeremiah, that was such a powerful word just now. I mean, I could hear the emotion in your voice, the passion that you feel for equipping the next generation. I know it's a passion that we share here at the Colson Center, because you're exactly right. If we who are older and supposedly mature Christians do not think deeply about our faith, deeply enough so that we can truly pass down our faith to our children and our grandchildren, every new generation is up for grabs. The next generation is going to have to be re-evangelized. And we're not the only ones out there with a message. There are other competing worldviews. Now, you said at the beginning of this broadcast, Jeremiah, that as Christian thinkers, we should not be turning to the entertainment media or the news media to get our worldview training. But many do. And if we are not, standing in that public square right alongside those competing worldviews, we're going to be in big trouble, especially when it comes to raising the next generation in the nurture and admonition of the Lord.
You're exactly right, Warren. And in fact, if I can just take control of the slides here for a moment, there
Sure.
are really two competing worldviews right now. If you listen to many of the secularist, nihilist professors, and I have this, Warren, the entire mission of our ministry is taking questions. We receive thousands of questions from believers every single month at Christian Thinkers Society. So many friends and family and grandparents and surrogate parents are so concerned because they send their kids off to school, right? And yes, they perhaps were raised in the church, but that professor goes poof in a biology class or some science class or a philosophy class, and their entire biblical worldview comes crashing down. Why? Because so many professors, and not all, but I speak as a professor about them, many professors are nihilists. They don't believe in anything. They don't believe in good. They don't believe in evil. And I just raised to you Richard Dawkins. And I want you all to study his face in this picture. This is such a powerful statement of one of the prominent competing worldviews that sets itself up against the Christian worldview. And this is Richard Dawkins. Of course, he wrote God Delusion, 3 million copies sold, multiple different languages. The universe we observe, according to Mr. Dawkins, has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom, listen carefully, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And you think, well, that's just the new atheist zoologist, Richard Dawkins. Well, guess what? This worldview has gained traction. Enter Peter Singer. I've just switched the slide. He actually said this, and who is Peter Singer? One of the most influential philosopher, notice, ethicists of our time. He says we can no longer base our ethics on the idea that human beings are a special form of creation, made in the image of God, singled out from all other, quote, animals, and alone possessing an immortal soul. This is indeed the worldview that sets itself up against the Christian worldview. And as you already pointed out, in the early world of Jesus, and the world in which Jesus was born, Warren, this was a world of fear, of superstition, of evil, and make no mistake, of super inequality. What changed that world? It was this new teaching that God actually loved humanity. I mean, Ludwig Feuerbach said that man made God in his image. The famous philosopher in the Enlightenment period, he said, God didn't make man in his image. Man made God in their image. Well, guess what? That was true of the Greco-Roman gods in the world in which the early church was born. The Greco-Roman gods in Corinth, you think about the places Paul preached, they didn't love anyone. They were capricious. They would commit all kinds of atrocities against humanity. And so when we read John 3:16, that there was this powerful teaching that God loved humanity, a world the force of the Greek with its fist stretched out against God, that message gained traction, especially when you think that 40%, by most estimates, of the Roman world of Jesus were slaves. I mean, when you just consider that, and yet by the end of the 3rd and 4th century, slavery is reduced to 15% of the empire. When we think about further inequalities in the worldviews, and folks, I'm saying this because we have to herald this message now. Christians have always valued life sacred to God, no matter what, quote, deformities or special needs or handicaps. This was a hallmark of the Christian church. And as you can tell, I'm getting ahead of myself. I know this is a conversation, but these are the worldviews that I wanted to react to in this book, because we can measure the difference that Christianity made with this message of God that created man in his own image, every person a special creation. And that's why you have something profound happen in the early church. You have, because people were divided. I mean, make no mistake, they were divided by race. They were divided by status, were you slave or free? And they were divided by gender. What do we see in the early church? We see that everyone coming together, worshiping, unified in Christ. We see Galatians 3:28 had taken hold.
Well, Jeremiah, that, again, another powerful word. And one of the things that, I love about your book, especially in the early chapters of the book, is that you quote a lot of Rodney Stark. And I'm a big fan of Dr. Rodney Stark. And he has written books like The Rise of Christianity, in which he documents some of these incidents that you are describing, or some of these epochs that you are describing. And of course, John Stonestreet and I mentioned a few of these in our book, Restoring All Things. Just this idea that the world was a very different place before Christians entered it. And that often it was, as you say, Christians standing for life, standing for human dignity, standing for this idea that we were made in the Imago Dei, in the image of God, and we are to live our lives coram Deo, before the face of God, and that will define, should define, in many cases does define all of our actions. And you mentioned something, Jeremiah, that I want to get you to drill down into. One of those areas of life is in this matter of equality, the idea that slavery was, if not abolished, at least dramatically on the decline after Christians came into the world. But you also talk about gender roles as well. There's often a rap against Christianity that we are bad for women. And you have very powerfully refute that argument. Can you say more?
Absolutely. And that's what's so cool about this webinar. Again, I thank you for putting it on. I want to show you a book here that this is one of the sources. This is an Israeli scholar, Benjamin Isaac, The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity. Briefly, I want to comment about Rodney Stark. I took this subject so seriously. I asked my good friend Craig Evans, who's been my colleague for years, one of the finest historical Jesus scholars in the world, to help me research. And we actually went over to Baylor together because we began to discover, most people don't realize, and Isaac points it out in his book, and friends, not to plug the book, but my book has 40 pages of notes at the back where you can look into these great sources and learn more. I mean, I just touch on these, as you can imagine, in a popular book. One of the things that I noticed, Plato, Aristotle, these individuals who give us this writing of democracy and, quote, freedom, they were actually the original racists as well. We really have found in Plato, found Aristotle, things like slaves were living property. According to Aristotle, a slave is a lifeless tool. Polybius said that, same thing, very similar comments. And Isaac, after reading him and then studying, putting together the research for Unimaginable, I began to notice that at the end of the 3rd century and into the 4th century, there is no writer no great thinker that takes up this cause of racism. Of course, what was the racist word in the Greco-Roman? It was barbaroi, or barbarian, the singular. That was the word that, it was actually Plato who gives this idea of eugenics, that Greek word eugenis, well-born people, to not make the precious metal DNA impure. And all of a sudden, we see that that racist ideology stops at the end of the second, into the third century. And for more than 1,000 years, no writer, no thinker, no philosopher takes up this racist cause again. Well, this is why I went to see Rodney Stark. And I laid out all of our findings. And he literally called this part of the book solid gold. And he said, you're absolutely right, Jeremiah. There's no question the impact of the church caused racism, listen closely, to recede. When does racism rear its ugly head again? In the 17th, 18th century, with the so-called Enlightenment thinkers who actually take us back to a pre-Christian atheistic time, take us back to that pre-Christian, really neo-pagan time, and they begin these racist ideals again. And so many of the Enlightenment thinkers, I'm getting too far afield, but I talk about this in Unimaginable, they were slave owners themselves. They were for the transatlantic slavery. And of course, then Nietzsche drinks deeply at this well, and Nietzsche comes along, one of the most influential philosophers even today, sadly, in most philosophical programs. And he says, it's okay if we need to cull the herds of humanity for the master race. And, this is why a webinar like this is so important, friends. Ideas are powerful and ideas have consequences. So that's a small footnote, but on to equality, if I may, Warren. Friends, sure. There's so many things we can get to, but I want to just show a passage to you that because of our historical distance, because we don't understand the inequality that was rank. Again, remember that people were divided by race, status, and gender when the book of Romans is created. Now, I want you to think about for a moment the book of Romans, the most powerful document ever written. We would never have had a Reformation without the book of Romans. And Paul writes this passage in the final chapter. And if we don't have something of the context, we lose the power of it. Paul says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe. Now, remember that word Phoebe, a deacon of the church of Cenchrea. That was about 10 miles from Corinth. I ask you to, who's he writing to? The church at Rome. I should really say the churches of Rome, the house churches of Rome, the leaders of Rome. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people, and to give her any help she may need from you. Now, watch this next part. For she has been the benefactor, prostatis in Greek. It's a hapax legomena, only place that Greek word appears in the Greek New Testament. She has been the benefactor, I love this, Paul writes, of many people, and me also. Now, given the backdrop of P.Oxy 744, this is the document I begin my book with, and John Stonestreet referenced this recently. This is a document, friends. This is in the 1st century BC. Hilarion writes to his wife Alice. He's away working in Alexandria. She will give birth to their child before he returns. And he says, if it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, trash it, throw it out. So given that backdrop of crazy inequality, the centrality of women in the life of Jesus in the early church is nothing short of astonishing for that time. One of the reasons that the early church grew so quickly and took over the Mediterranean world was the early church stopped practicing infanticide, especially as it related to females. And we can actually document, and by the way, this is tweetable. I believe this to this day. The church would not exist right now without women. The church would not exist historically without females. And this is one of the lasting legacies of the church, because the closest competitor to early Christianity was the cult of Mithra. And this was a cult that was very popular in the Roman legions, but guess what? It was male only. Females were not allowed or invited to participate. The early churches there, females participate, and we know that by AD 80, the early church is 60% women, which is just phenomenal. Even in Judaism of that time, and I'm switching my slide here, this is Rabbi Judah, 3rd century AD. 3 benedictions, which we should say every day. Blessed be he who did not make me a Gentile. Blessed be he who did not make me literally an ignoramus, and blessed be he who did not make me a woman. So even in Judaism, I mean, Paul, as a Benjamite, he was definitely a male chauvinist, and that would have been normal. Because again, Rabbi Judah, better to burn the Torah than teach it to a woman. What do we see in early Christians? Early Christianity brings equality to gender, And they actually see women raised up as leaders in the church. And this is actually remembered. And if any of you have daughters, Audrey and I have a 9-year-old daughter, Lily Faith. And we're already teaching her to be a second Phoebe. Why? This is a fantastic inscription that was found. It's actually at the Museum Biblique in Jerusalem. It was found on the Mount of Olives, limestone inscription. Phoebe is remembered. Now, make no mistake, Phoebe couriers the letter of Romans to the churches at Rome. And friends, if I can just show you what this looks like for a moment. Let's say I have the book of Romans. It wasn't like Amazon Prime. I mean, she didn't leave it on the doorstep of the early churches and walk away and ring the doorbell. It was understood that if you were couriering a letter for someone, you were presenting it in that person's place. Let that sink in for a moment. The Apostle Paul asks Phoebe, his prostates, his benefactor, to present the letter of Romans to the church leaders at Rome. Wow, that is mind-boggling to think about, given the historical backdrop of boy keep it, girl trash it. It's amazing. So this is so fresh in the early church's mind that we have here a limestone inscription thanking God for a woman by the name of Sophia. She's the bride of Christ, Sophia. She's called a minister, the second Phoebe. Isn't that amazing? So she's honored as a second Phoebe. We see this also in a brand new mosaic that was just found in 2017 in Bethsaida. And this is in Greek. And I don't know if you can see it. It's on the right on my side. This is a lunate sigma. It looks like C, almost like WCANN. That's a lunate sigma in Greek. This actually says, set up by your servant Susanna. Again, a second Phoebe. And so, friends, Warren's exactly right. It was a world of gross inequality. The church stood against infanticide. Tertullian every leader stood up and said, this isn't right. And so I'm going to be bold in my faith. I'm going to stand against this gulag, this cult of death around me. And I'm going to tell everybody they have value because they were made in the image of Almighty God.
Wow. Jeremiah, again, just a powerful story. And, we unfortunately are coming to kind of the end of the time where it's just you and me, and I want to bring in some questions from our audience. Before I do that, though, let me just remind everyone once again that if you want to ask questions, you can tap on the questions tab on the sidebar, depending upon the device you're using. It's either on the side or up top, and type in a question. We've already got a lot of questions, and we're going to get to those in just a few minutes, Jeremiah. But, before we do, you've shown us some really great slides, and I know because you showed me some of your slides before we got started that you've got some more. And I'm just wondering, before we sort of move into the Q&A, is there a story or an image from the slides that we didn't get a chance to talk about that you wanted to maybe share with the group before we went into the Q&A time?
Yes, thank you, Warren. I'm going to do this very briefly. One of the outcomes, the fun thing about being on this webinar is you get a lot of delicious details that didn't make it in the book. I mean, truly, my editor, Jeff Braun, said, stop sending me examples of how the church is changing the world. We have to keep this book accessible. But I want to show you all the earliest depiction of crucifixion that we have. This is really cool. You all are looking at the actual inscription on the left, and then a drawing of it on the right, just for clarity. This is incised on the Palatine Hill in Rome. So the Palatine Hill was like the best hill. It was the best zip code. It's where the Roman emperors lived. And this is really interesting. It's incised in Greek. But notice the photo of it. We see a guy with his sword on the left, and he's worshiping. You see his hand up in the air? But he's worshiping an image that's being crucified. And we see the body of a man with wounds, and yet it has the head of a donkey. And when the Apostle Paul writes, in Romans 1:16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to them who's being saved. And then in Corinthians, when he writes, for it is the word of the cross that is foolishness to those who don't believe. I think of this. And do you know what it says in Greek? It says Alexamenos, that's his name, Alexamenos, and then Sebita, you see that lunate C again, that's an S, Theon. Alexamenos worships his God. And this was an insult, friends. Somebody saw that there was some Roman soldier who was worshiping his God, and they said, his head's more like a donkey, and I could go further there. And this is just a crude insult. This is dated to 160 AD. And Warren, in the adjacent room, there's actually a second writing incised in Latin. and it said, Alexamenos fidelis. Alexamenos is faithful. So as you think about it, Alexamenos here is pictured alone, and he's enduring crude insults that are really at his master. And friends, if we're going to change the world, we have to be willing to stand alone sometimes to stand against evil practice. And so I want you to think about Alexamenos worships his God. What a powerful reminder that I can be faithful to, even in the midst of persecution. And the problem is we need Christians to be thinkers, and we need Christians who will stand up, be winsome to win people, absolutely, but be tough and stand alone if we need to.
Yeah. Well, Jeremiah, what a great word and a great segue, if you will, into our first question. So I'm going to just pivot into the Q&A now, if I might. And we had a question from Richard. And Richard has noted that many people who have Orthodox Christian beliefs are being vilified in the public square today, maybe in some ways like Alexamenos was vilified in his day. But we think of, for example, Mike and Karen Pence recently. I don't want to make this a political thing, but, when Mike Pence, for example, said that he would not ride in a car with a woman, or when Karen Pence was vilified because she teaches at a Christian school that holds Orthodox Christian beliefs. And so Richard's question very specifically is this: how do we effectively combat current attempts of secularists to disqualify Orthodox believers from service in the public square based on their Christian beliefs? Have any thoughts about that, Jeremiah? Be like
Richard,
I guess would be
Absolutely. And Richard, what a great question and what a great comment. First, I agree with your assessment. There is no question that Christians are being mocked and vilified in the public square today. And that bothers a lot of believers. And that causes a lot of believers on the sideline to think, I'm not going to tip my toe in that because I don't want to stand for my faith like that. And so we recoil. And yet we need Christians, Richard, who embody Jude 3. Remember Jude 3, epigenizomai, contend for the faith that was delivered once for all. How do we combat it, though, specifically to your question? It's really part 3 of my book, Richard. I wanted to study first, part 1, what the world was like before Christianity, part 2, what the world was like in the last 68 years when one half of the world's population turned its back on God. But in part 3, I call it Jesus's tour de force. And in chapter 12, I actually point out 12 immediate ways the world would be different tomorrow if Christians vanished. And these are not like spiritual, I'll pray for you, brothers. These are, guess what? 46,000 of the food banks in America that feed the homeless every single day and give them shelter, 60% of those are Christian organizations. So, Richard, if the church vanished tomorrow, America would starve to death. 90 million Americans live in federally recognized shortage areas of qualified counselors. And so what fills the void? 353,000 clergy men and women who fill the void by dedicating 10 to 20% of their work week to give counseling and mental health services, oftentimes for free, helping people on the front lines. I could go on and on. 70 million Americans who are helped every single, and a lot of this is just American centric, so apologies. I have other, I was a faculty at Acadia in Canada and lived in the UK, but as it relates, I think, to what Richard's asking, 70 million Americans are served every single year, fueled by $20 billion in donations. But Richard, here's where it takes the cake. Are you ready for this? I'm in my home here in Fort Bend County, the most ethnically diverse county in America, here in Houston, Texas. Love Houston. I was evacuated, I and my wife Audrey and our 5 children, including 13-month-old triplets at the time, during the apocalypse that was Hurricane Harvey. Worst natural disaster. I've written an op-ed on it. You should check it out. But here's what's fascinating to me. 179,000 homes are lost during Hurricane Harvey. I hate it. I had finished my book, Warren. I know you've been there, and I have this great analogy that I could have used. What filled the void when everybody was saying, pray, help? People are stranded. There is no one coming. I mean, they shut down our Pecan Grove volunteer fire department. What filled the void? This is documented. The Christian church, Calvary, came to town. And you know what really gets people angry at me, but it's true? My parents' home was flooded in Fulshire. It was unlivable. They had sewage in their home. They had men and women knocking on their door every day, Warren and Richard. I'm a Christian. I'm from such and such church down the road. Can we help muck out your house? And every person who's watching in Houston now knows what I'm talking about. And guess what? Here's the point of how we can combat the people that speak against us. I didn't see a single atheist tent handing out bottled water after Hurricane Harvey. I didn't see a free thinkers group that was serving humanity, because you have to understand, in that worldview, man is not special to God. You're an accident. You're a two-legged animal. So really, we have a choice to make, don't we? Is that the worldview we want to pass on to our children? Law of the jungle, two-legged animals, or made in the image of God? So that's how I would answer it, just knowing how the church is making a difference and being that difference.
Well, that's right. I think, just knowing these stories, Jeremiah, is so important, because the argument is not going to go away in the short term. I don't believe, in the public square. And I think but what you've highlighted is that it's a slander. It's a falsehood. It's untrue, this argument against Christians. And if we simply are equipped with stories like the ones you're talking about, that alone can be of tremendous value in combating that slanderous secularist argument in the public square.
Absolutely. I totally agree.
Well, Jeremiah, we've got another question. Again, it's a tough one. You mentioned that whenever Christianity rose in the world, slavery declined in the world. Many of our listeners are going to know that William Wilberforce, based on his Christian beliefs, helped end the slave trade in Britain, and it was a watershed moment in modern world history. However, Sheila does point out that slavery is mentioned in the Bible. And her question specifically is this: often those who object to Christianity point to the scriptures references, in fact, condoning, or what appears to be a condoning of slavery. Do you address this in your book, that slavery is cited in the scriptures and it is not the same as the modern concept of slavery? First of all, is that true? Is the slavery talked about in scripture different from the modern types of slavery that are so destructive in this world? And is it true that slavery, that the Bible does not, in fact, speak out against slavery?
Thank you, Sheila, for the question. With any book like this, you have to set up guardrails. And what I love about these kinds of events is it gives me the opportunity to add all of my footnotes. And so this book, the purpose of this book was to celebrate the unimaginable contribution of Christianity on the world and what the world would be like without Christianity. I was not able to add a appendices, and maybe it will be in a follow-up, about the things that we're not so proud of as Christians. The Salem witch trials, the Crusades, people always point to those, the conquest passages in the book of Joshua, and of course, slavery. And what I would say this, because Sheila, I'm an exegete, okay? That's what I do. I exegete scripture. I help Christians understand the Bible in its original context, because Sheila, as you probably know, heresy happens every Sunday. All we need is Jesus and no context, or the Bible and no context, and heresy happens. And unfortunately, at different, very difficult points in the church's history, we have had different Christians rise up, and they pull a passage out of Scripture, and they do what's called eisegesis. They read in their own modern understanding into that ancient passage, and then they do biblical vandalism. Now, what I would say about slavery specifically, it's never spoken about positively in the Bible, Old or New Testament. And this is where, if we had time to do a biblical interpretation class, there is a difference in the scriptures between descriptive and prescriptive passages. We see that it is descriptive. I mean, you could not, if you and I could go back in time right now to the world of the early church, slavery was awful. It was terrible. It's probably worse than any of us can even imagine. I don't have time, and even I don't know the age range, but if you were born a female, it was just not a good situation for you. All you have to do is go to Pompeii and see the terrible sex acts that are incised on the wall of female slaves and brothels and whatnot. But we never see it looked on positively, and yet it was a fact of life. And so we see, in fact, we see it actually some positive things. Paul says to Onesimus, no longer your slave, but your brother. I mean, that is powerful when you think that the Roman economy was a slave economy at the time that it was written. So I do think as Christians, we need to understand how to rightly exegete these passages. And there are differences as it relates to the Old Testament, if this is the kind of slavery that people have in mind, or is it more indentured servitude? And I don't think we need to get that far afield in this conversation, but there is a difference of opinion among that. My book, though, does discuss slavery in 2 different chapters, and racism, which is not identical, but of course related. Thanks for the question.
Yeah. A couple of housekeeping items, Jeremiah. Brenda just says, thanks so much for this important and timely topic. I'm taking notes, she says. Well, thank you, Brenda. You'll have a chance to watch it again. I just want to mention one more time that we are recording, and everyone who is either watching or even if you just signed up and we're not able to attend today, we're going to be sending you an email with this recording. David asked a question, Jeremiah, that you used a word that maybe some of our viewers are not familiar with, and that is the word Judaica. Could you briefly define what Judaica is?
Yeah, it's just the world of Jesus. Thanks, and I'm sorry. I'm always constantly trying to, so I appreciate you sharpening me. It's just the world of Jesus in the early church. When we talk about Jesus in Judaica, Jesus was a Jew. He was from a certain place, and we understand that world, and that world actually helps us interpret the scriptures so much clearly. And so when I say Jesus in Judaica, we get into that world so we can rightly exegete and understand the passage. And when we do so, we're still able to draw out those timeless principles, but we actually understand the authorial, the original intent of the writing. And so that's what I'm discussing. I mean, here's another just nugget for you. When we think about burial traditions today, I just love this. Don't you just love how the Christian church utterly changed the world? But here's a way you may not be aware of. If you and I were wanting to bury a loved one in the time of Jesus, we really could choose. There were three things. There was a mausoleum, there was a sepulcher, or there was a memoriam. Those were the three styles of burial in the Greek mind: sepulcher, memoriam, like a memorial, or a mausoleum. Those were the only terms that were known for burial in the first century. Christians come along, and they're so committed to everyone being made in the image of God that they actually want to be interred and buried together. Now, this is fascinating when you think about it, because 1,500 bodies were dumped per year in the city of Rome alone. So if you were your typical Roman slave owner and your slave was really sick and ready to die, you would grant them freedom to die just so you didn't have to have the expense of burying them. And if you can imagine walking around on any given week in the city of Rome, bodies dumped everywhere, disgusting practice. What stopped this? Well, Christians invented a new term for burial. Are you ready for this? Koimeterion in Greek. Guess what that term is? Cemetery. Do you know what it means? It means dormitories or sleeping rooms. Christians were so impacted by, and we haven't had time to touch on this proclamation of this physical bodily resurrection from the dead. Not a good place to start in the Roman mindset. Nobody believed in, was entertained by it. You know, it wouldn't have been like today, Walking Dead, all of this nonsense. Nobody was entertained. It was a disgusting thought in early Christianity. And so if Christianity wanted to invent a new belief system that was unfactual, they would never have started at this physical bodily life coming back from the dead. It was disgusting in the Roman mindset. Outside of Judaism, no one believed in physical bodily resurrection. And even the Jews, it was more of a general resurrection. And so what do we see with Christians? They actually innovate a new term for burial. And we see 1 million Christians, nearly 1 million Christians are buried together in the first 3 centuries in the city of Rome. If you all have been there, you know the catacombs. You can actually see those were the original art galleries. The original Christian art galleries were the catacombs, these amazing depictions as Jesus as shepherd or ichthus. And it's powerful. Christians buried together. They invent this new term, koimeterion, and guess what it means? Dormitories, sleeping rooms, because the Christian will rise again. And that's just another neat way to me that every time you drive by a cemetery, it wouldn't be called that without the early church.
Wow. You know, Jeremiah, you mentioned the Enlightenment in your presentation fairly early in our conversation as being sort of a defining moment in sort of the intellectual history of the world. Mark asked a question that's kind of related. He says, was there a definitive moment or maybe just a long slippery slope that brings us to this point in history? Is it possible to say that there was a moment or a series of moments that brought us from a place where Christianity was on the ascendancy in the world to a point where now many people believe that Christianity is in the decline? Or was it is it kind of too difficult to sort of trace it to a single or a few key moments?
Great question. These are fabulous questions, y'all. Keep them coming. Really good. A couple of things I want to say to that. Answer the last question first. Christianity, 70,000 people a day right now, according to Richard Bauckham in his book published by Oxford University Press on Jesus. 70,000 people a day are coming to faith in Jesus Christ. Now, people always go crazy. That's the highest of all time. It's not happening in Western countries. Okay, that's happening in places like Africa, Asia. The church is in decline, as I think many of your audience would know, Warren. You all have written about it with the rise of the so-called religious nuns, those who check the box, church is irrelevant to me. I'm no religious preference. So I am excited. And I want to say this, I am filled with hope. I'm not one of those Christians that always has a boogeyman, although I also I'm not isolated. I can read the world and be discerning around me. But we are living in the golden age of Christianity right now. And this is where my apologetic tendencies come out at being an apologist. You can know more about your faith right now than any of the great Christians before us. Augustine, Spurgeon, none of these people knew about all the extra biblical confirmations of New Testament history or biblical archaeology or the great embarrassment of riches we have with biblical manuscripts that shows that we're reading a stable text, that the text we read was actually the text Paul wrote and the other New Testament authors. So I'm really excited about it, but was there a certain point where we see it start to tip, where we see the secularism? Because make no mistake, when you look at Europe, I've written a book on Islam. I'm very concerned about the lack of Muslim evangelism among some Christians. A lot of militants speak, but not a lot about evangelism. There are many missiologists that believe by 2022, 2025, Europe will be majority Muslim. It will be the dominant religious preference in Europe. What happened? I mean, when you think about Europe, the gospel sending continent, we see what's happening in the UK. 2.8% of Britons, only 2.8% attend church with any regularity. I have a heart for the UK. We've done 3 Christian Thinkers Society events in the UK. John Lennox said it best, based on a BBC documentary. Why have so many Britons left the church? Why do 98% no longer attend? The church will not answer my unanswered questions. That was the number one reason given to the BBC. They see the church as increasingly irrelevant. And we see so much of that coming over now into the United States. But I would mark it, and this goes to part 2 of my book, and it's cryptic to read, but I really study. There's a chapter 8, Atheism and the Broken Soul, where I actually quantify these Enlightenment thinkers who chuck the Judeo-Christian principles, the Christian worldview, and this ideology of racism and superiority re-emerges. And we see that these dangerous thinkers, and I actually call them the Fab Five: Ludwig Feuerbach, Sigmund Freud, Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, these men literally come on the scene and they begin espousing these new ideas. I mean, with Darwinism and scientism, Hitler has a scientific justification to commit mass murder based on the science of the time, and Darwin thinking of polygenesis, that certain DNA lines are less evolved than other DNA lines. And then we hear this eugenics. We haven't heard about eugenics since Plato, and it's these Enlightenment thinkers. So I think we can trace so much of it back to them. And the problem is the ghost of Nietzsche is alive and well today. We saw that, I don't know when you're watching this podcast, but we have seen this culture of death that keeps reemerging where life is redefined. And that's why I praise God for the work of the Colson Center and support it myself.
Yeah. Well, Jeremiah, thank you for that. We're coming close to running out of time here, but I want to try to get to a couple of what I think are really key questions before we close. They're tough questions, so we may not have time to really address them. But Ellen asked a tough but I think an important question. She says she's a committed believer and she's been active in her church for a very long time. She also acknowledges that, what you said, there's some truth in what you said, that wherever Christianity entered the world, that the role of women was elevated. But she also says that she sees a whole lot of prejudice against women in her own church. And it is, and I think many women might share Ellen's perspective that it's one thing to say that, well, Christianity might have made it better, but it's still got a long way to go in a lot of churches. What word would you have for Ellen and for other women who might be listening, or men for that matter, who can look around them and see that even within the church, we are not always living up to our aspirations or to what Scripture teaches?
Ellen, such a great question. And I speak at women's events across the country where you are certainly not alone. They don't feel like there's equality in their church. They don't feel like they have a voice. They don't feel like they can fully use their gifts. And I would just encourage you to be a Christian thinker yourself, to go back and study. I have 2 chapters on the role of women in the early church. And I know there's some debate, and I'm not here to debate, but what I am here to celebrate, what I can celebrate and be intellectually honest celebrating, is that the church would not exist without women. The church would not exist without females. When I read Luke chapter 8, verse 1 through 3, it was females who supplied the financial needs of Jesus Christ for his ministry. And Luke's doing something fascinating there, as only he could as a gospel writer. Those are the same women mentioned in Luke 24 who are the original eyewitnesses. Remember, Luke uses that term autoptes in Greek. We get the term autopsy from it. They're the same women who are the original eyewitnesses of the empty tomb tradition. So not only did these amazing women follow Jesus, support him financially and his disciples so they could focus on serving the Lord, they were the original eyewitnesses of the resurrection. We see already the prominent place of Phoebe in Paul's ministry and life, delivering. And by the way, it's historically speaking, the first place that this term deacon is used applies to Phoebe in Romans 16:1 and 2. I'm just fascinated by that. I think it's a dialogue worth having as a New Testament historian. And I think the problem with the modern church is we take a long time talking about what women shouldn't do. And I know there are differences and certainly important denominational distinctions. We don't celebrate what females have done, and that the church would not exist today were it not for the influence of females, especially in those first 300 years. I mean, it's fascinating when you think about it, when you really think critically about these things. Women far outnumbered men in the early church, so they married men, and a lot of men were converted when they married these Christian women and came into the early church. Stark, as Warren already points out, really highlights that. Rodney Stark does in a lot of his works. My testimony, Ellen, is such that I would not be following Jesus still today were it not for my mom's influence on my life. I had decided that I didn't want to be a Christian anymore when I was an 18-year-old freshman at a Christian university. And I would just encourage people, when you get your eyes off Jesus, life can get so confusing. And mine was. I saw people that claimed to be Christians, and they didn't act like what I thought, or at least what I was raised that a Christian should act like. And I just thought, I actually called my dad and I said, if that's a Christian, I don't want to be a Christian anymore. And he was like, I'll call you right back. And then my mom called me, and she picked me up, or I picked her up at an airport, and we spent a 1,000-mile drive together. She was available. She let me share, and she made this profound impact on my life. And there are no silver bullets, I get that, but I wouldn't be an apologist today without the influence of my wife on me. And so, as a Christian historian, I have to be intellectually honest in the way I exegete Scripture. And I've already shown you 2 slides, Sophia and this church that's set up by Susanna. I can't ignore these things as a historian. Certainly, they're important office, and hear me, important official gifting distinctions. But the purpose of my book is to celebrate the important and vital role of female in ministry today.
Jeremiah, one final question before we go, because I know a lot of people are in the same position as Patrick, or a similar position. Patrick says that he has a childhood friend with whom he's been able to reconnect on Facebook, who is this is Patrick's words, poster child for the leftist vitriol that you, Jeremiah, have already talked about from people like Richard Dawkins and Peter Singer. And they've been communicating much more on a personal level. His wife, for example, his wife's illness, and just trying to be a friend, while they're going through trials. But Patrick also says that he wants to go deeper in the conversation and talk more about Christianity. But he just knows his friend is so antagonistic towards Christianity and has such vitriol towards Christianity. And I know many of us, Jeremiah, have family members and friends and neighbors who are just so broken by the world, or maybe even broken by someone who claimed to be a Christian.
Yeah.
What word do you have for us? I mean, I found what you shared with us today to be very nourishing, but I'm a believer and I'm looking for sort of that strength. How can we translate some of what you're saying to our friends and neighbors who are not going to be receptive, maybe at least initially, to some of the ideas that you've introduced?
There's a couple practical things, Patrick. Number one, I would always begin my conversation with questions, not assertions. I have found that people, especially who have this hostility towards Jesus, and usually it's hostility, as Warren just pointed out, towards some negative Christian experience. And there's plenty of those. We all have them. So it's not usually hostility towards the person of Jesus. It's hostility towards an experience. I would always begin with a question instead of an assertion. I would practice what a good friend of mine taught me once: shut up and listen. So many of us Christians, especially when we decide to become Christian thinkers, we have the ready-made answer. And so often there's just power of silence, listening, letting them lead the conversation. But then thirdly, asking the Holy Spirit to give you discernment for those specific moments when you know that person's heart is open and listening. It might take a month, it might take a year, it might take longer, but that's where we can't get frustrated. And we have to be willing to stand for our faith, but we have to be winsome and loving like Jesus. And it's so hard when people talk about the Lord to not take it personally. I get it. But you just have to ask the Lord to just give you that attitude of Christ, because they're wanting to incite you. They're wanting to do kind of the shouting match, which has no substance, but like these new atheists enjoy doing, the sound bites. Just kill you with 1,000 sound bites, but there's really no substance. As I said when Warren and I began, that 63% of atheists think churches contribute nothing to help the social ills of society. And so, and then finally, I would just focus too. I would be ready with the ways in which the church is changing the world. And I talk about that in chapter 17. I wish I had time to share more of Dan and Lynn Wagner's story. I don't. But it's a powerful story of forgiveness, where it just shows the X factor of Jesus in the world. I close the entire book with it because, I don't want this today to be a cerebral exercise. There are men and women who are heroes. You don't read about them in your news feeds right now, but they are making an utter difference for the Christianity today. And friends, that is the greatest apologetic of our faith. Not just being, I'm the smartest person in the room. No, I'm making the greatest impact in my community, serving people that where I expect nothing in return. I think that's a great way we can reach those friends, Patrick.
Well, Jeremiah, that's again another great word and a great way to close our time together. And unfortunately, friends, we do have to close our time together just a couple of minutes before 1 o'clock on the East Coast. And I need to share with you a few items that answer maybe some of the questions that we didn't get to. One was a question that came from Stephen. He says, I missed 3/4 of the webinar today. How can I access it on demand later? And the answer to that question is that we will be sending you an email within the next 24 hours that will have a link to a recording of this session. It will also have a link to Jeremiah's book. This is our February resource at the Colson Center. For a donation of any size to the Colson Center, we're going to send you a copy of Jeremiah's book, Unimaginable. So you can either wait for that email and click on the link there, or you can go to breakpoint.org anytime, day or night, 24/7, 365, and you will be able to, at least for the month of February, be able to find a link, maybe even a pop-up on your front page that will take you to a page that will allow you to get a copy of Jeremiah's book, Unimaginable. I also wanted to mention that if you liked what you heard today, come to the Wilberforce weekend. Jeremiah is going to be one of our speakers. The theme for this year's Wilberforce weekend is Christianity still good for the world? And not only are we going to hear from folks like Jeremiah Johnston, but also from John Stonestreet, who we've mentioned today, and John Lennox, the great Christian thinker from the UK, is coming over to participate with us in the Wilberforce weekend. And we've got just a whole bunch of fantastic speakers lined up. I think we've got a total of close to 20 speakers that are committed and will be with us for the Wilberforce weekend, which is May 17 through 19 of this year. You can find out more information about the Wilberforce weekend by going simply to wilberforceweekend.org. That's wilberforceweekend.org, and you can find out more information. Would mention that February 28th, the end of this month, the price goes up. So if you want to sign up and be with us at the Wilberforce weekend, sign up early and sign up your family and friends as well. So with those couple of announcements, Jeremiah Johnston, let me just say again, thank you. We are so grateful that you and the Christian Thinker Society are partnering with the Colson Center. We're so excited about offering this book, your book, as our premium for February, and also for your participation in the Wilberforce Weekend. Before we go, any final word from you?
Warren, so grateful, and we're going to continue the conversation of the Wilberforce weekend, so be sure and be there. So thanks again for everyone who took time to join us. We really value your time and love to connect with you further.
Great. Thank you, Jeremiah. Thanks to all of you who were with us today. God bless you. Have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.
Blessings.